Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 12-Minute Leadership Series. My name is Pittampalli. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. Today we have a really important topic, which is how to give advice. Now, everyone thinks they know how to give advice, but not a lot of people actually do. And it's unfortunate because any leader in any organization has to give advice all the time, not just to colleagues, but to direct reports, to mentees. Heck, even your friends are going to ask you for advice, so you better be good at it. The problem is, have you ever been in a situation where you've tried to give somebody advice and either you or them have gotten really frustrated? It's a pretty common occurrence, right? Or somebody has asked you for advice and you give them advice, and then by the end, you feel like you've wasted your time, or they feel like they've wasted their time, or you both feel like you've wasted each other's time. This is again really common, and the reason why this is there's lots of different kinds of advice, and what's happening is you're probably providing advice that is incompatible with what kind of advice they want or they need. So today we're going to talk about how to give a good advice. What is the kind of advice you need to give that is appropriate based on the situation and the person? And I'm going to argue that there's 3 roles you need to take on when you're giving advice. You need to either be a friend, an aide, or an advisor. Okay? Now I'm going to define those in a second, but first I'm going to take you through this flow chart, which will give you a sense of how you know whether you should be a friend, an aide, or an advisor, and I'll explain what these are along the way. I emailed everyone this flow chart. It's a PDF. I'm going to be doing everything on the board. If you can't download it for some reason or you didn't get it, don't worry. There's a link in the chat box. You can try, but if for some reason you can't access the Google Drive, I will email this to you later. Just send me an email and I'll email it to you. But you don't necessarily need it for right now. Okay, let's get started. So if you look at this flow chart, you start up right here, right? You start when somebody asks you for advice, right? That's the starting point. So the first question you need to ask when somebody approaches you for advice is you need to ask yourself this question. Is this person interested in accuracy or social support? That's what this SS stands for, right? So we all know that sometimes when people ask for advice, they really don't want advice, right? They're not really looking to better their decision, right? Most advice is given to help somebody make a better decision. But sometimes people really don't want advice. They just want social support, right? And if they want social support, if they just want somebody to listen to, say they want empathy, they want praise or encouragement, then what you need to do here is you go this way in the flow chart, and that means you're a friend. A friend doesn't offer advice at all, okay? You're not in the advice business when you're a friend. If somebody comes to you for advice, yet you realize that you should be a friend because they really want social support and not accuracy, then don't give advice at all. Give them praise, give them encouragement, give them empathy, but don't even try to give them advice or else they're going to get really angry or defensive at you. Okay, so that's the first step, right? So if, for example, you realize that they do want accuracy, right? They are interested in making a better decision, or you've judged that even if they don't want accuracy, it's your responsibility to make sure that this is a good decision because they're going in the wrong direction. Now you're here, right? Now you're in this question number 2, which this box says, is this person low or high in autonomy? Is this person low or high in autonomy? What does autonomy mean? Autonomy is a personality trait, which basically means a inclination or people who are prone to crave independence, right? They don't like when people try to infringe on their freedom or free will, right? So if somebody is high on autonomy, they will often get really defensive when you give them advice, okay? It's funny, right? Because they ask you for advice and then sometimes you give them advice and then they get mad at you and you're like, but you came to me for help, right? This happens all the time. So what you need to do is realize that if somebody is high in autonomy, you end up over here, which means you're an aide. You're not an advisor, you're an aide. Now, what is an aide? An aide is a person who isn't trying to steer the advice recipient in any specific direction. They're just giving them information, okay? You're more of like an information desk. Right? So you give the person information on alternatives. So for example, if simple example, somebody asks you for a recommendation on what movie they should go see. Well, instead of saying you should see Rocky IV, which by the way is the best movie of all time, and trying to really sell them hard on going to see Rocky IV, which is going to provoke reactance on their part, right? Because they're high in autonomy, they're probably going to get defensive. They're probably not going to like it. They're going to feel like you are infringing on their free will. They're going to react adversely to that. In fact, what the research suggests is what happens is often a boomerang effect. So not only might they just ignore your advice altogether, they may actually go in the opposite direction. So you recommend Rocky IV to them, and just because they don't like this, they'll actually, to spite you, go see the Hunger Games instead, right? This happens all the time. So that's why when people are high in autonomy, okay, if you really are interested in giving them a better quality decision, which is the whole point of advice, you want to use indirect methods. So focus on information, right? So like if you do think that Rocky IV is a great movie, for example, tell them some information they didn't know about it. Tell them that Sylvester Stallone is in it. Tell them that it was one of the biggest box office hits at the time, for example. You're giving them facts, right? You're not steering them in any specific direction. You're just giving them facts and information about particular options. Okay, so that's what you want to focus on. Okay, so if you find that they are low on autonomy, okay, so they're not high on autonomy. They're not going to get really defensive. They don't crave independence. They're actually kind of a little bit more amenable to feedback. Well, then you can go in this direction, which is to become a full-blown advisor. So when you're an advisor, you have free range to give any kind of advice you want. Okay? You can give information on alternatives, right? But you can also advocate. You can advocate and tell them, hey, I really think you should go in this direction. Or I really think you should go in that direction. I really think you should go to Yale as opposed to Penn State, for example. You're really kind of trying to persuade them in one direction or another. You may not want to do that. You may want to just give them information. You may also want to give them advice on the decision-making process itself, right? Which is the kiss of death when you're an aide and somebody's high in autonomy, but when they're low in autonomy, you can say, hey, have you thought about contacting this person? Have you thought about doing a pros and cons list? Have you thought about adjusting the frame through which you're even viewing this decision, right? These are all fair game when you are dealing or when you're an advisor. An advisor is kind of gives you the freedom to be able to give any kind of advice that you want, okay? Because that person is not going to react defensively to you, okay? So a couple of points here. One is you're going to have to use your judgment on these things, right? So when somebody comes to you initially, you may not know exactly whether they want accuracy or social support. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, but sometimes you'll start giving them advice, right? And you start to realize that, they're not really taking this as kindly as I thought. They're kind of shutting down. Well, then you may realize that this person is really looking for social support, not for accuracy, right? So you need to be a friend. If for example, you're trying to decide whether somebody is of low or high autonomy because you want to know whether to be an aide or an advisor, well then if you haven't had a lot of experience with this person, you may not know how autonomous this person is. You may not know how defensive they're going to get if you try to steer them in a certain direction. So you just have to use your best judgment, okay? You have to try to ask yourself, navigate the conversation. So as you start giving this person advice, how are they reacting to it? And if you start steering them a certain direction and they start to get very defensive, then you need to pull back immediately and start making sure that you're an aide and not an advisor. Okay? So that's it, folks. This is how to give advice. Remember that when you start out, when somebody approaches you to give advice, do not just launch into the advice first. Try to identify first, before you give advice, the fundamental question, which is, am I a friend, am I an aide, or am I an advisor? Okay, so right now I'm going to start taking questions because I'm sure hopefully there will be some questions about how to implement this. So if you're here just for the 12 minutes, congratulations for making it this far, and feel free to send me some questions afterwards if you'd like, but good luck with this. If you have questions about this, let me know right now. Okay, put your questions in the little chat box and I will spend some time answering it because I know this can be a little bit of a tricky subject for people. Okay, so I'm going to go in and see if there are any questions. So Natalie has a good question, which is, I'm surprised you recommend that I don't give a friend advice. I do it all the time. Why shouldn't I? It's a really good point, Natalie. So we don't want to get too hung up on terminology here. When I say friend, oftentimes, you're a friend of somebody and you give them advice, right? And in that case, I would argue that you're being an aid, because even if the person is just your friend, you can be an aid or an advisor. What I'm just saying is that friend basically connotes that you're not trying to steer them in any direction. You're not trying to give them information. You're just trying to give them love and support. So you can give friends advice, but I'm saying if you're acting in the capacity of a friend for the purposes of this framework, then don't give advice. Okay, but that's a really good question. Any other questions here about giving advice? Let's see. Okay, how do you know whether somebody is of high or low autonomy? It can be tricky, okay? But the key signal here is whether the person is getting defensive or not, okay? When you start to give somebody advice, what's going to happen is if you pay close attention, you're going to realize that they might be getting defensive, right? You can see it in their body language. Sometimes they won't say anything to you, but if you see them, you're going to notice that they might, for example, cross their arms, or they might kind of like look away, or they might there might be some constriction to their face or something like that. Well, that's when you know that this person may feel like I'm infringing on their independence, which sounds strange, I know, because they came to you for advice. I totally understand that, right? But in the same vein, we do this all the time, right? There's not one person on this call who hasn't at one point or another gone to somebody for advice, and then when they gave them that advice, felt like they were being, controlled or being dominated, okay? So what you need to do is you need to judge, are they getting defensive? Is this the kind of person that feels like I'm kind of overstepping my bounds if I'm kind of pointing them in a certain direction? Now, here's the thing, by the way. Autonomy is an individual personality trait, but it's also a situational variable. So, for example, I have high autonomy with some people and low autonomy with other people, right? So if I'm talking to a friend of mine or a mentor of mine, I may have low autonomy because I really want their honest recommendations, okay? But if I'm talking to my mother, for example, and it's about a business decision, I may not want her to intrude and give me specific recommendations. I may just go to her for information, for example, okay? So again, this is a judgment call, but the more you start thinking about this and the more you could become aware of this stuff, the better you'll be at identifying this. Okay, let's see other questions. When should unsolicited advice be offered? That's a really good question. So I would argue that unsolicited advice should be offered here when you're making this decision, okay? So somebody comes to you, either somebody comes to you for advice and doesn't give you, or doesn't want you to come for advice, but you notice that they are going in the wrong direction. And you feel like it is your obligation or responsibility based on your role or just you're caring for this person that I need to improve the quality of this decision because this person is just going in the completely wrong direction. That's when you would offer unsolicited advice. I mean, this is a narrow thing, by the way, because we don't want to go around giving unsolicited advice all the time. But when you feel like somebody's really going in the wrong direction, even if they're coming to you just for social support, it may be your obligation to say, listen, I know what you probably need is somebody to listen right now, but I really think you're going in the wrong direction. And I would feel remiss if I didn't tell you that I think you should go that way instead. Okay? It's not an easy decision to make, but it's a decision that every leader has to make. Can you tell the level of autonomy in a virtual meeting? If so, how many people act differently in a crowd? This is a fantastic question, Carol. So I have a two-part answer to this. One is it's more difficult to tell if somebody is high in autonomy when you're in a virtual meeting if you can't see them. Because a lot of what's going to happen, a lot of the signals you're going to get on whether somebody is really feeling like they're being infringed on in terms of their independence are going to be visual, right? You can see it in their face. You can see it in their body language. You can also see it you can also hear it in their tone. So if you're on the phone or if it's a virtual meeting on a call, you may be able to judge by their reaction by the quality of the tonality of their voice. That's one thing, but it's harder. Okay, so that's the first part. The second part is public versus private dynamics are crucial. Okay, if somebody is in a crowd, right? If you're in an audience, if you're in a group setting, they are going to most likely be much more autonomous, or they're going to have a higher level of a need for autonomy. Okay, because people are in the room, not only do we hate when people infringe on our independence, but we hate when people see that because it makes us look weak. It makes us look like we've been dominated. So you have to be very careful about giving advice when you are in front of other people. Okay, so that's a really good question, good consideration. Any other questions? Okay, one more question. Do you see any pitfalls with asking someone directly, do you want advice or do you want support? That's also a very good question. I think that at sometimes you have to, because the consequences of giving someone advice when all they want is social support are pretty significant at times, right? We've all been in the situation before. Just put yourself in their shoes where you really don't want advice. You just need somebody to vent to. You just need somebody to talk to or to listen, and they start giving you advice, and this really makes you feel either demoralized or angry at that person, right? And so sometimes it's easy to decipher whether that person really wants advice or they just want social support, but sometimes it's not. So if you can try to determine that yourself, that's great. But if you can't, it's a fair question to ask. You may ask them just straight out, just like you said. Listen, I have some ideas on how maybe you might want to think about this question or this problem, but is that something you're after? Is that something you're looking for right now? And usually when people, if you say it sincerely, when people hear that question, they respect it and they'll answer candidly. So they'll be able to tell you whether they need support or not. All right, folks. Well, thanks for attending this webinar. I put a link in the chat box again to this flowchart, which is a little bit more detailed, and it's in PDF form. So in case you can't really see it here, you'll be able to follow along in that PDF.